الضيفة المتحدثة عايدة هرنانديز كاستيلو، وهي بروفيسورة وباحثة بمركز البحوث والدراسات العليا في الأنثروبولوجيا الاجتماعية بمدينة مكسيكو. بالإضافة لعملها الأكاديمي، عايدة كمان كانت ناشطة جدا في حركة المجتمع المدني الداعمة لنضال حركة الزاباتيستا. والمداخلة اللي رح تقدمها اليوم هي حول التحديات أمام تحرير النظرية النسوية من الاستعمار، تأملات في الممارسة عند السكان الأصليين في أمريكا اللاتينية.
Good morning, كيف حالك? I'm very glad and very moved to be able to be with all of you here in this such a difficult times for Palestine. And before starting my talk, I just want to tell you that I come from a generation in Mexico. I went to the undergraduate studies in the 80s, in a time in which the struggle of Palestine was very important symbolically and politically for an entire generations of Latin Americans that believe in the struggle for social justice. So being here for first time in my life, when I turned 50s, I really feel that it's a privilege to be able to know all of you and be able to build bridges with the academia in Palestine. So I'm very thankful with Lena and Linda, with the two L's, for inviting me here. And what I want to share with you today are some of the theoretical and political debates of what it means, the decolonization of feminist theory in Latin America, and what I have learned as an ally of the Indigenous movement, mainly in Mexico, but I also have done field work in Guatemala and Colombia. And I have been working for many years with the network of indigenous peoples in the Americas. So my experience comes from my work as a university professor, but also as a feminist activist that is trying to find another path of theorizing and also of de-centering, of destabilizing some of the theories that are coming from the global north and that many times talk in the name of social justice, but that they end playing and colonizing roles in the epistemologies or the way of knowing of the academia in the global south. So probably some of you in the gender studies program are familiar with the work of Chandra Mohanty. 30 years ago, Chandra, who was then a young Indian scholar coming from Nigeria, where she was working as a rural teacher and came to the United States, she wrote an article that is untitled On the Western Eyes. She published that article in 1984. And in this article, she was, the main point of the article is that many feminist scholars of the global north, she was analyzing publications by a feminist publisher that is called Press, in their effort to save women of the global north, they were always representing them as victims. Victims of their religions, victims of patriarchy, victims of their traditions, victims of their culture. And by victimizing them, they were again and presenting their own feminisms as the path to save those women in the global north, were against reproducing these strategies of colonization. So when I read this article for first time, for me, I felt that she translated to an academic language, something that I have been hearing in many contexts, and it was a discomfort with feminist discourses and practices that many indigenous and popular women in Latin America were expressing during that period. And this slide? And so I translate her work to Spanish for the first time, and it was very shocking for many feminists in the academia, because that critique can be very easily applied to not only to the feminism that comes from the global north, but to feminism that comes from academia and that tries to save indigenous in the grassroots movements, and that many times create this hierarchical relationship. So I after I translate this work, I start to search for on genealogies, because the decolonizing fall has been present in Latin America for many, many years. Before this path of decolonization, there is a group, I don't know how familiar you are, but in the US there is a Latin American diaspora that had been writing about the paradigm coloniality and modernity group is known. Names as Arturo Escobar, Maria Lugones. But the problem and the main argument of this group is that this dichotomy between the coloniality and the modernity project is a false dichotomy, because modernity continues to be a colonial project, and that they're very linked to each other, and that this colonial legacy construct our societies, not just in situations like Palestine, where settled colonialism is always present, but in many other societies, like in Latin America, where the nation states were built in the lands and the imposition over the indigenous people's societies. But this critique of the present importance of the colonial legacy was already in other forms of theorizations. So it's a paradox, because many of those scholars that are concerned with the colonial legacy and how to decolonize our knowledge reinforce the colonial strategies by denying our own theoretical genealogies that had been discussing the importance of this impact of colonial enterprise. And in the case of Latin America, there are two main paths in which colonialism had been discussed. One is the paradigm of internal colonialism that was developed mainly in the early 80s, and that it was a critique to the idea of development and modernization as the path that Latin America should follow. And what mainly those theoreticians were saying is that for the unequal relationship between urban areas and rural areas was allowing the industrial development of the urban areas in the Latin American countries. And this unequal economic and social relationship was also marked by an ethnic and racial hierarchy, because a lot of the peasantry in Latin America is indigenous peasantry that has, in which the urban elites had reproduced a colonial relationship with the indigenous rural areas. But this analysis of the late 80s that was very influenced by a branch of Latin American Marxist thought. This internal colonialism, you can easily recognize Wallerstein perspective and the worldwide system. But the indigenous movement itself was writing political documents as the Barbados Manifesto that was published in 1971, in which they were saying the colonial relationship is not only economical and political, it's also epistemological. What it means is that colonialism works also by imposing ways of knowing, by imposing ways of imagining personhood, of imagining who you are in the world, of imagining how do you relate with nature. So they were criticizing epistemological colonialism in the 70s, but they were doing this in political documents that usually academia only see as raw data. It never recognized that those are forms of theory, that theory is also outside these rooms. That theory was yesterday in Damascus door in the chantings of the women that were talking about colonialism in a different kind of textual strategies. And I feel as a university professor, I always try to include in my courses other kind of ways of theorizing. And although I feel inspired by this coloniality modernity group that is talking about decolonization of knowledge, at the same time I feel uneasy about the denial of all our legacies, because this kind of critique had been present in the political movements and in the social movements for a long time. So I think that a first step is to recognize other ways of theorizing. And another very important link between these theorizations, like the Manifiesto Barbados, but I'm just using this as an example, but we can find in the early 20s and 30s in Colombia, you can find documents in which they were talking about, the indigenous movement there was talking about already of the different forms that colonialism was taking. So it's very important to approach those documents. And the other important legacy in Latin America is activist research. I could say that action research, with the influence of the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, it's a contribution to the alternative methodologies all over the world. And he was mainly working in the area of education, but he influenced research in many places. And the feminist groups in Mexico were also influenced by these methodologies that, I mean, I'm not going to go into the entire, probably some of you, how, is Paulo Freire known in the Middle East?
Yes, he's translated into Arabic.
Okay. So what happened with Paulo Freire methodologies is that many feminist groups that were working in the rural areas start to question their own hierarchies and trying to use those methodologies to build from the bottom up how rural indigenous women understand social justice. What is their understanding, for example, of when they talk about woman dignity, what do they refer? So instead of going to those rural communities to teach women rights, so how can we use those methodologies to learn from these dialogues? Mercedes Olivera is a Mexican anthropologist who had been working in rural areas. He was involved in the guerrilla movement in Guatemala, and then she went to Nicaragua, and she's one of the matriarchs of Mexican rural feminism. And she never institutionalized herself, so she is now in her early 80s, and she's still working with the Zapatistas. She's one of the few feminists that is working, I will tell you a little bit more about Zapatismo, but, and in these practices, they created a lot of methodological materials to work with indigenous women in very creative ways. And some of her the women with whom she had been working, now have created a woman, it's called the Center for Women Rights in the city of San Cristobal de las Casas, in which they are working with tools of legal pluralism. So they are not just trying to change the laws of the state, but they are trying to influence customary law in rural communities so they can include gender needs in customary law. So it's a very different project than other institutionalized projects in which gender perspective is being institutionalized from the bottom up. And but something that because I did my PhD in the US, I went to Stanford. When I came back in the US, I had the privilege to be able to learn from Native American theories on settled colonialism. The concept settled colonialism is not possible to translate to Spanish. There is nothing that we can use, say it in Spanish, that would mean settled colonialism. And there is very, very little known about settled colonialism. So the paradigm is more about internal colonialism. That's the concept that we use. But there is a lot of similarities of what we discuss when we talk about internal colonialism and settled colonialism. So I literally say it in Spanish, is the colonialism, the colonial forces that come to stay. It's the closest that I can describe in Spanish what you will say by settled colonialism. But when I read Native American theories, and Audrey will talk about that I think on Monday, there are many things that we can learn from those theories for the Latin American context. The problem when I talk about methodological nationalism, what I refer, is that because we are so close to the empire, we have a border with the US, there is a lot of rejection to anything that comes in English. So people think that if you include in your courses any literature that it's in English, you are just imposing against the imperial thought. So for me, it has been a struggle to say we have to open our minds and hearts to other experiences, because there is also a global south within the north. So there are experiences there. And for me, three schools of thought that were very important were the Native American theories on settled colonialism, the Afro and Chicano feminism. Chicano is the self-describing concept that Mexicans of second and third generation are using in the US, and that are theorizing a lot how racism, patriarchal violence, and capitalist exclusion are related and embedded. And critical race theories that come mainly from the law area, in which critical lawyers are talking about how racism impacts the legal system and the law itself. This woman there is Gloria Anzaldúa. She's a feminist Chicano theorist who theorized from poetry, from creative writing, and I don't know if you include some of her work in your curriculum. Because it's very interesting, her work. Yesterday that I was in the wall, I was thinking a lot about how she talks about borders and the violence of borders that cross our lives and lives. And there are so many bridges that we can build about that violence. So this book, Decolonizando el Feminismo, Teorías y Prácticas desde los Márgenes, is a book that I edited, translating some of these authors, but also authors from other areas. Amina Mama from Africa, Saba Mahmood, who is Pakistani, but her experiences with Muslim women in Egypt. So I translate those works to Spanish for first time, and with an effort also to make these bridges with the Global South. And but these moves in the academia also have a very important context talking about where theories are coming from. And this context is the Indigenous Women Continental Movement that was denouncing colonialism and gender violence as not a problem of the past, but a present problem that is marking daily life. Mainly since 1992, when it was a huge celebration of the 500 years, the official discourse was the encounter of the two worlds. They said, in Spanish, there is a word, encounter is when you encounter somebody, and encontronazo is a clash. Is when it's a violent encounter. So they were saying, no es un encuentro, es un encontronazo. It was not an encounter, it was a clash. And it was a huge movement of 500 years of indigenous Black and popular resistance in all the continent. But it was a movement to denounce the continuity of the colonial project. But in this encounter, where the main goal was to denounce how the present nation state continued to reproduce the colonial strategies towards indigenous people, what has happened is that when women from different indigenous areas got together to discuss their experience with the nation states and the colonial legacies of the nation state, they were saying, but many times our own leaders within the indigenous movements are reproducing the kind of authoritarian styles of the colonial nation states. So without any need of a feminist theory or anything, their own experiences start to say, el finquero está también en la casa. The landowner is also in our houses. By saying that many of the practices of the large landowners were being reproduced within their houses. So that was the beginning, and also in a dialogue with their compañeros, with their companions in the struggle, by saying we cannot change the world outside if we don't start by changing the world within the limits of our households. Right. And so all those spaces of encounter were happening in many areas of Latin America. But in January 1st, 1994, a very important movement took place in the south of Mexico, in the state of Chiapas, that is a border with Guatemala. I was living there for 10 years when the Zapatista movement arose. And it was a movement that brought together the anti-colonial struggle by saying our nation states have excluded indigenous peoples with racist strategies historically, but neoliberal systems are the present form that the colonial strategies are taking. And in January 1st, 1994, it was the beginning of the free trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States that mainly opened the markets to products, agricultural products of the North that are subsidized, that are technically produced. So the local markets were being affected very deeply. But this also came, the free trade agreement, with an entire discourse of modernization and structural reforms that the new governments have to pass in order to get the US economic support. So the structural reforms implied the privatization of communal lands of indigenous people by a reform in the Constitution. We haven't, it's very difficult to give you all the context, but we had a social revolution in 1910 with a lot of limitations, but among other things, it distributed the land and gave some social rights. So the new structural reforms were changing the Constitution to limit a lot of these social reforms in the name of development and modernization. So the Zapatista uprising was against this new form of colonialism that takes the form of structural reforms and neoliberal economy. But it had something different than other revolutionary movements in Central America didn't have. Not the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or the FMLN in El Salvador, or the Montoneros in the South Cone. And it was that it has as a core the inclusion of women voices through the woman revolutionary law. The same day that the struggle started, they took over the main city in Chiapas, that is San Cristobal de las Casas. I was living there then. They distribute in a small newspaper that is called the Guerrilla Awaken, Despertador Guerrillero, that included the women's revolutionary law. That was a law that was created by women of 400 different communities, in which they gave her word of what it means for them to have their woman's dignity recognized. And in this women's revolutionary law, they included some demands towards the nation state that were a critique of the exclusion of indigenous people, but also to their own communities, to customary law and the exclusion of women to inherit land. And it also demanded the right to choose with whom to marry, because in many indigenous communities there still exists arranged marriage. So they were talking about, and so it was, the chart itself, it was getting together the demands of collective rights against these neoliberal reforms, autonomic rights, but the rights as women within the demands of collective rights. So they were not saying, we want private land and to inherit private land. They were saying, we want to be included in the access to land within collective rights. So it was the chart itself and their voices were on one hand confronting the ethnocentrism and racism of urban feminism, because they were saying your discourses of liberal rights and gender rights are not what we're talking about, because for us the common is very important. Community, collective rights is at the center of our needs. But at the same time, they were also confronting machismo in the indigenous movement and their exclusion. And this chart became a symbol for many women in all Latin America. Indigenous women in different organizations developed their own theorization of gender and ethnic inequalities. And although the chart, the Zapatista woman law, was not known with details, many women were using that to say, we have rights as indigenous women. Because as happened in many, I don't know how is it, I'm not familiar with the issue in this struggles for justice in Palestine. I promise I will read more about it. But it happens in many revolutionary movements that as soon as women talk about their exclusion within the movements, they are accused of being traitors of the cause. So for indigenous women in many countries to say, we are now talking about feminists of the global north, we're talking about indigenous women in Chiapas that are saying that we need to change violence against women, that we need to change many issues of customary law that is excluding us. So I was in Ecuador and I had the chance to work with an indigenous organizations in El Chimborazo, that is a volcano area, and they were telling me how they were using the chart in the workshops. So if you see the map, Mexico and Ecuador are so far away. So for me to see how those discourses of emancipation travel are being used was so inspiring and moving. And indigenous intellectuals who are publishing were also recovering and using those theorizations to, this one in the bottom, she's Emma Chirich. She's a Maya scholar. She has a PhD in anthropology, and she has been published. She's from a Maya group that is called Cachiquel, so she published in both languages. And the other one is Alma Lopez. She's an Amuzgo woman from Mexico. So they play a very important role, first to question colonialism within the university. what are we teaching in our gender studies program? Who do we read in our gender study programs? How their voices and theorizations are being included or not. And just as an example, in Guatemala, there are only 3 women, indigenous Maya women with a PhD. Aura Cumas, Emma Chirich, Irmanicia Velázquez Nimantu. None of the 3 have a position in the university. The 3 are freelancers working with NGOs and doing. So there is still a lot of racism within their own institutions, even progressive ones, that talk about racism. It is very difficult to include those kind of scholars. And they are in a very delicate position because in many of the indigenous movements in Latin America, the Maya movement, but also the Andean movements in Bolivia and Ecuador, there is a tendency to idealize indigenous cultures as cultures that are marked by the balance with nature, by their complementary relationship between men and women. And every time that they say our cultures had a cosmovision that vindicates complementarity, but our present lives are marked by the colonial legacy and men are violent and they are hitting their wives and there is domestic violence in our communities, they're immediately being accused of being traitors. So but their allies in the feminist movements are usually women that are being funded by the international cooperation in which the discourse of women's rights is a liberal discourse that does not include their critique to colonialism, to racism, or their demands for collective rights. So it's a very delicate path through whom they have to move to find allies and to let their voices be heard. So I'm just mentioning some of them there. And well, their voices were fundamental for the emergence of new theorizations that are now being distributed in Latin America, talking about the need of decolonizing feminist theory. This is 2 of the books, and in the case of my book, their indigenous intellectuals are together with Muslim feminists, with African feminists that are criticizing colonialism as an inamama. And we can see how many bridges can we build because settled colonialism takes different forms, but it still marks the life of many women in the global south. As scholars that are concerned with social justice, we confront other challenges when the field is home. When you are not going to go to this remote place, but you are studying, writing, and trying to influence a place and a reality in which you are part of the same reality. And this, I think that part of this challenge, Miriam Jimeno is a Colombian anthropologist, and she talks about an investigador ciudadano, the citizen researcher, in which studying the shared reality creates the responsibility of being an outspoken voice, a public intellectual, to use your privileges and your knowledge to impact the society in which you are part. So it's not that you, usually when this context is the context of knowledge production, it's not that you are going to produce certain kind of knowledge for social justice to save somebody else, but it's a knowledge that has to do with saving all of us, with trying to impact the reality that is going to be the reality in which our kids are growing up. So it really creates a totally different relationship with knowledge and knowledge production. And in the shared vulnerabilities, because it's not an in and out of the field. In my case, I'm not going to talk about this, but the last year I have been working with mothers of kids that had disappeared. And that had disappeared by the police, by the militaries, and by the organized crime. And it's a very vulnerable field anything that you write can also put you in a vulnerable position. So it means that confronting systemic violence and impunity with your work also forces you to create a different kind of academia, in which we have to create communities of knowledge and competing among us and trying to get, well, in Mexico there is now a very hierarchical academic systems of points. Everything you write, you make, gives you points that will reflect in your salary. So that, can we go to the next one? That, I know, so let me close the idea here then. So then it promotes a very individualistic academia. And when you are producing knowledge in vulnerable contexts, you need to create community. And we need to confront also these systemic ways that marks the academic space in which we are producing knowledge. I will not talk, if I have time, a little bit more about this. But here I want to talk about, I want to talk just about two of them, but two intercultural dialogues that have helped me a lot with my own decolonization of feminism. One is the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of the Americas. That is a network that I have been accompanying, being alive for many years. I consider myself a mixed race woman. My grandparents belong to an indigenous peoples of the north of Mexico that are called Lloremes, are people that were nomads, and now they are not anymore. But I didn't grow up there, so I consider myself a mestiza. I cannot consider myself a Lloreme because I'm not recognized as a Lloreme. But I have been participating as an ally in the Continental Network of Indigenous Women. The other one are my dialogues with two indigenous leaders that have been very important to denounce the impact of militarization in Mexico. They were both raped by army men, and they went into a struggle for justice in different levels of justice, and they have been very important politically. And the last dialogue, I have been working for 10 years with indigenous women in prisons, but I'm gonna talk about this on Tuesday. We're gonna see a film about this experience. And in this, moving with this, in these dialogues, there is a temptation. On one hand, I see these two extremes between what Edward Said calls Orientalism and ethnocentrism. So on one hand, working with these indigenous women who had experience of community building, who have been defending their resources and their forests, their waters, creeks, there are a lot of knowledge that we can learn from this experience, but very easily we can construct them as the alternative epistemologies that will save all of us. And by doing that, it's also again denying the complexity of being a human being in this world. I have a Chol, Chol is a Maya group, a Chol feminist friend who say, every time that I hear these new agey feminists that are talking about us as the woman that will save them, I get so upset, I can barely save myself. I will not save you. You have to save yourself. So it's how can we recognize their knowledge and their experience without denying or without constructing this myth of the pure knowledge that will save us. But the other extreme is ethnocentrism, and this perspective of universal woman rights that do not consider any cultural context, historical context. And in the work against violence, it's very easy to reproduce this and go to legal reforms that penalize domestic violence, and that in many cases means to put men of vulnerable sectors of society into jail. And for many indigenous women, they say, if you take him and put him to jail, there will be nobody to work the land. So you are not helping me. In many communities, through customary law, A man that is beating his wife is being publicly ashamed by the elders first, and then he has to do collective work, usually with the mother-in-law or the elder woman that doesn't have a man in the house. So they have other alternatives towards domestic violence that doesn't mean imprisonment. And because indigenous men now in the war against the narco are the first ones that are being imprisoned. So we don't want to give more elements to the colonial nation state to put those men into prison. So the solutions that the feminists, urban feminists, with the penalization of domestic violence are searching are not the solutions that many indigenous rural women want for their lives. And we have to be open to other alternatives. And this continental network has 52 organizations of indigenous women. It was formed in 1993. And they are from the north, there are women from Canada, the US, and South America. As any network is very difficult, you have there women that come from the guerrilla movements of the 80s, and they're very Marxist and anti-religion. You have very Catholic women that come from a background of liberation theology. So it's very diverse, so to build a network with different backgrounds has been a challenge, but they have been able to maintain this network for almost 25 years now, and creating alliance. For example, when a Canadian mining is being opened in Mexico and is dispossessing indigenous women, they contact the Canadian women that are in the area where the mining has its main branches, and the Canadian Native Americans help them to make protests there. They're trying to articulate a transnational network alliance. And as I told you, it's very complicated to make those bridges. I have located mainly 4 genealogies: the peasant and indigenous movements. There are mainly people that came from the struggle to defend their lands, communal lands. Revolutionary movements. These branches are much more Marxist-oriented. And the liberation theology, that is a branch of the Catholic Church that is using the Bible to analyze social inequality. And rural feminisms, as like the Mercedes Oliveira experience that I told you. So the perspective about justice, we cannot say indigenous women had this agenda about gender justice. Each of them are very different. They have to negotiate many things. The issue, for example, of the legalization of abortion is a big issue. Not all of them agree with it. The women that have more from a Catholic background have a lot of tension on how to deal with it. And I mean, I have found indigenous women that said that religion is the opium of the people with these same words. So the Marxist background is there. And I think that it's very important to recognize this diversity, because it happens many times with the scholars that you used to give voice to those that are closest to your political agenda. So if you are more into alternative epistemologists, you will go to those women that talk about syncretic religion and in Maya cosmovision, and you do not want to hear those that are Catholics, because that's not like the indigenous voice that you are concerned. Or if you are a very radical feminist, you will go to those that talks about women's rights, and you will like. And I think that even when you only represent with your work one voice, you do not help to promote the bridges that they are trying to build. You influence to deep the big differences that exist among them. And I feel that the new challenge that we're facing in Mexico with activist research is, well, this epistemological Eurocentrism that I was telling you, how to include and learn from these voices, and how to decentering our role as intellectuals in these dialogues of knowledge. Because going back to the Freire experience that I was telling you about, although Freire was always talking about building knowledge from the bottom up, usually our Marxist comrades go to the communities in a role of the organic intellectual that will raise the conscience of the popular sectors. So they don't challenge their own certainties. They go there also to, just the idea that you're going to raise somebody's consciousness assumes that there is a false consciousness and there is a truth that you will go there to share. So to create a space of epistemological dialogues means to be able to doubt of your uncertainties, to be open to learn from other experiences. And this is not an easy task, because this hierarchical relationship, even with political organizations, had marked our relations with those popular sectors. Usually they expect that you will go there to give truth. And if you go there and say, I don't know the answer, it really puts you in a different position, and I want to learn with you. And I have many experiences to share, but I don't have enough time, but it's... And well, the violence in the field, I was telling you about confronting the neoliberalization of academia, academic capitalism. So how the systems that we theorize a lot in our classes now about decolonizing knowledge, but we are competing against each other, we are counting our points, how many these PhD dissertations we are advising, how many books are we publishing, and we are not building community in the daily life. And if we work in contexts of violence as Palestine and Mexico right now, we need to build emotional communities, not just academic communities. Communities in where emotions are not something that you're gonna leave behind and try just to be a footnote, in where emotions is also part of the way we are learning about the world. Emotions are dealt with, are shared with. We cannot send our students to do field work in context of violence and not give them the tools to work with this emotional part of the field work. So I think that as educators, our commitment to decolonize should start from these rooms of the way we relate and the tools we're giving to our students. I think well, I'm just going to mention very briefly because I talked too much. So another very important dialogue with me had been with an indigenous organization that has been working against the militarization in Mexico. Very briefly, in Mexico, the drugs cartel have been controlling not just many areas of the country, but have been working within the state. It's not that the institutions do not work and not being able to control the narco. The state is part of this network of drug dealing. And the answer to the problem had been militarization, with a very complex impact of what militarization means. The weapons are coming from the United States. A lot of weapons are circulating, crossing the border. And these same weapons are being used to kill young people, to kill indigenous resistance movements people. And sexual violence is being used as a tool of counterinsurgency. So this organization was created in 2002 to denounce that the militarization of the country is not the answer against the cartel war, but it's part of the problem. It's giving men the weapons. So in many cases, what the issues of domestic violence in which a man will hit a woman, when he has a weapon, he will kill her. So the feminist side average is going up and up. And that means not just domestic violence, but it's a lot of sexual workers are suffering with this kind of violence. The Maquila woman in the north of Mexico started a phenomenon that is called the feminicide, in which there were mainly poor women of dark skin, indigenous background that were being killed, and bodies were being thrown to as disposal bodies. There are many theories of why that was happening, but the main explanation is because they can. Because there is impunity, because there are weapons, because there are armed men that can possess women's bodies and can throw them away as garbage. So they organized against this militarization, and two of their leaders, this is Valentina, she was only 70. This is Inez, the one in the middle. She was 30 and she already had all those kids. They were gang raped by the army in their houses, and they were part of the woman organizing sector of the OPIM, of the organization. So if the idea was to demobilize the organization, the strategy was wrong, because they didn't become victims. They become political organizers that were denouncing the impact of militarization and sexual violence. It is a long process, and I'm going to go through that, but the case went to the Inter-American Court, and one of the issues that for me was very important, talking about the decolonization of feminist theory, is that since the beginning, she doesn't speak in Spanish, her language is Mepa. She didn't go to school at all. She doesn't know how to read or write. But since the beginning of the case, with a translator, I was part of the legal team that was supporting the case. She told me, the problem are not the 3 men that raped me. This is a part of a long history of my people. We had been raped historically, or territories had been occupied historically. So for me, the reparation will not be to put the 3 army men on the jail. For me, they should be collective reparations. And one of them is that we don't want the army to enter into our territories without demanding permission from our elders. That was one of the reparations he demanded. And she also wanted to create a center for women and men, MEPA, for MEPA, women and men rights as part of the reparations. So the legal team needed to prove that an individual aggression, as rape, needed collective reparations. So that's what they call me. I'm a legal anthropologist. So I have to present an expert witness report that show how the sexual violence was impacting the community itself and the region. And I'm gonna leave this book in the library, and the expert witness report is an appendix, but one of the chapters deals with the case. And I discuss also how there is a totally different conception of personhood. It's not just that her demands of rights are different, but her conception, and many times it's very difficult for us to understand that for many women, who you are doesn't finish where your flesh or your body ends. So who you are goes beyond your body. Mm-hmm. So that's why the reparations are not just individual reparations. So we won the case, and it's the first time in the Inter-American Court, in the history of the Inter-American Court, that an individual case have collective reparations. So that was very important. But not only that, but because of this case, the Mexican Constitution has to be reformed. And from the case on, any violations of human rights committed by the army or any military force cannot be judged by the army. It had to be judged by a civilian court. Mm-hmm. So that was a very important gain that we had. The center has been created. Now we're working together because they don't want to be the center, a typical center of women's rights. Mm-hmm. So they are working also using spiritual ways of healing for women victims of violence. They're working with men, they're working with kids. They have a shelter, not a shelter, it's a boarding school for boys and girls that is going to be run by the women in the community. So I think I'm close. Okay, well, this is the case in the court, blah, 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 blah. Okay, just to finish. So I just want to close by saying that these experiences of other ways of thinking on woman dignity, on women's struggles, as feminist scholars or scholars that are working in women's programs, my center message is the need to create an ecology of feminist knowledge that includes other ways, other voices, other ways of imagining women's dignity, that question the well-being of the individual that had been universalized by liberal perspectives of rights, that we have to recognize the plurality of feminist knowledge that exists in the world and be able to learn of this plurality.
Thank you, عايدة. نفتح المجال لأسئلة ملاحظات ونحاول تكون يعني مش كتير طويلة، نحاول نجمع الأسئلة يعني وهي بتعلق عليهم بالنهاية. حدا تاني عشان حدين.
So actually, I'm really interested in your notion of theorizing by listening to voices and observing. And there were lots of experiences here in the Palestinian context where actually the women's movement, the activist movements, was progressing even in front of any theorizing. But my question is, what is a theory? How do you consider this as a theory, and what are the parameters that you sort of shape a theory, and what is considered a theory and what is not?
Well,
حدا تاني عنده سؤال؟
Well, I think that there is a complex analysis of how reality works, and that this way of analyzing reality can take different textual forms, and that academia has created a hierarchy of knowledge in which you have to speak in a certain way so your analysis of reality can be legitimate. But that many popular women have very complex analysis. For example, Inez. Her idea of a continuum of violence that had marked the life of her people, and that her rape, there were not three bad men that couldn't control her sexual instinct and rape her. It was not, she was very clear that it was part of a broader history of her people. And you will say it academically, systemic violence, historical colonial legacy. She will not say that. But what she was saying was exactly this. She was saying violence has been part of the history of our people since the colonial encounter. So my case is not an exception. So I don't want reparations just for me. So I think my position in academia is that we go there, we treat testimonies as raw data, we use their analysis, we put it in our words, we appropriate their knowledge, and we then legitimate that knowledge as theory. And what is there is just raw data that we are going to process. But there is an analysis of reality there, and very complex analysis, and in many times much more complex than the analysis that comes from academia. So, I mean, but it's not easy to, I mean, my position, for example, with my students, sometimes they use poetry in their frameworks, and when I invite to their committee scholars from other universities, they are in problem, because they think that it's not serious academic work. So for me, it's a challenge, because I don't want my students to suffer in academia But on the other hand, I think that we should move the limits of what are we understanding as theory.
Yeah. Thank you very much. My question is a simple one to see if you could speak a little bit more about the building of communities within the academy or amongst academics in terms of the academic, but the emotional support. So if you have examples of doing that processes.
Okay. Before everybody start leaving, I brought this was, I'm going to talk about the prison project on Tuesday, but these are bookmarks made by inmates. And this is a painting process in which they work with their emotions and ink. And it says, it's a thought of one of the inmates. It says, now I'm searching to honor every word that comes out of my mouth. And so they sent it. I told them I was coming to Palestine, so they gave it to me to distribute. So please take one and thank you.
And
pass it around.
Can I, before you answer the question, we give Audrey also to...
Yes.
I just brought a postcard with a link of my latest film that I've made, which is about femicide, and this is for the families if someone was missing or murdered, so that they can conduct their own investigations, and you can find it on YouTube.
So I have the privilege of working with a team of researchers and professors in CSS that we all work. It's an area of specialization in gender studies and legal anthropology. And we all work in different issues, but related with access to justice and legal activism. And one of the things that we do, we try to do periodically, is that we have like emotional workshops with the aid of a friend that has been working with victims of militarization or political prisoners. She's a friend of ours who works in another university. So we can share our experiences in the field, our emotional situations, because we work with a lot of people that have been victims of violence, and those testimonies also mark our bodies, or having nightmares, insomnia. I have a knee injury, so I live with chronic pain, and I think that also this kind of body pain is also related with a lot of emotional things that we're living. And Mexico is living a very difficult situation right now. We live in the context of a lot of violence. So what we try to do is to try to have a space to share and to work with the help of other therapeutical help at least once a week. Just the day before I came, we had one of those workshops. And we also try to work with our students about what are they going to face during the field, and try to contact them all the time when they are working. So it's just our own strategies, but we work a lot collectively in the sense that, for example, now that I work with the mothers of the disappeared, we work with an interdisciplinary team. It's an archaeologist, because we're searching for the bodies and we're finding the bodies. So it's an archaeologist, a physical anthropologist, I'm a legal anthropologist, and a psychologist. So we work together and we tried. So it's not that, oh, she broke herself when we found the body, oh, and that's a gossip. No, we try to put those emotions in the center, to speak about them and try to deal collectively with them. And in the case of our students, we also promote a lot that they work in teams. Even when dissertation has to be individual, that they can work together when they, well, many times the field is going to your own community, but trying to work, live together if you have to move away. So that's, and in terms of academic production, we have been publishing a lot collectively also. And well, it's very difficult to struggle against the institution because the institution wants certain kinds of production. But we have strategies. For example, I'm a tenure professor. So with the younger scholars, we usually try, if we have to have credits, we allow her, the ones that need the most, to be the first author. So we can reinforce her. Or if she's pregnant and she cannot teach as much as the other ones, so we work in teams teaching, and we get a biggest load of teaching the ones that is not pregnant. So we have a lot of strategies to try to work collectively. And really it had created an environment in academia that is a privilege to be there. Now with my back injury, the solidarity that I have felt with my colleagues had been immense and very important for me. And that's what we try to teach to our students also.
I thought the question about theory was extremely interesting.
Okay,
and your
sorry,
answer.
Roger.
Just really quick, I wanted to say to you,
Continuing.
and I'll write the name down for you. This is an Indigenous woman who works in academia in Canada, and she's working specifically on rape culture in university settings. So she has a talk that you can listen to, a podcast called Decolonizing Rape Culture, and her name is Sarah Hunt. So if you Google Sarah Hunt and Decolonizing Rape Culture, it's a fantastic analysis, and it really resonates with a lot of what Aida is talking about. Culture.
Thank you, Audrey.
My name is Audrey Huntley.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm Audrey.
تفضل روجر.
It's extremely interesting, the question and also your answer, because so instead of considering this body of knowledge, raw material on which to theorize in academia, you transfer the theoretical properties onto the knowledge as it's produced. The dilemma, of course, is that the minute you codify it, you're seizing it. So the theory has to be floating in a sense, because the minute you pin it down, you're doing what you wanted to avoid doing. So is this correct, and how do you deal with that?
Yeah, well, it's a big challenge. We are finally in a very hierarchical institution that is the university. So as soon as you use those theories and you publish a book with those theories do not have the fluidity that they do have in daily life. And that's a challenge itself. So what I felt is that by thinking in our academic products as part of a longer process and not as a goal itself, so that gives me helps me a little bit with the ethical dilemma. Because for me, then the book is just part of a longer process that continues, not when the book is over, but that continues when your practice, academic and political practice, continues being part of this process. So their knowledge is there and you are learning from this dialogue. And what I'm saying, when I talk about the ecology of feminist knowledge, I'm also saying that when I criticize the way we used to go there as organic intellectuals, it doesn't mean that we cannot say anything. Of course, we will share what we think we know. So we will continue sharing our experiences, but for me, how can we build dialogically? For many, just to give you an example, okay? I do legal activism. So I was working in a women's shelter, helping the women that are victims of sexual and domestic violence. And what I knew how to do was to accompany there to go to the state law, to how to create, how to sue, make a, how do you say, how to make a legal process when you are victim. But then we, with the legal team, start to realize that many times when those women were going back to their communities, they were being isolated because they passed over their customary law system and their elders. And so then I told the lawyers, we have to explore what resources are there. We have to learn more about customary law. We have to, and so the kind of a strategy that I had, it was decentered by the same experience that they had. So we have to totally change the strategies that we were using. And so it was a process of working in a different way. 10 years later, the shelter now is run by Indigenous women that are working with 3 systems, with the Zapatistas, with the customary law of the communities that are not in the Zapatistas area, and with the state. So it's, and of course, yeah, we frozen the theory by writing that, but it continues to be built.
You know, it's just a question that came to my mind. You know, this idea of having this dialogue with the indigenous to come out with an alternative epistemology. Now, I started, and I also understand when you said, like, as a researcher, you start to decentering your conception of yourself as a researcher. But then I thought, like, would these indigenous women take it like steps forward to be like also participants in the knowledge production itself? Like, I mean, what happens with the outcome of the dialogue? We take the data, we take the knowledge, and what happens after that? Like, do they like publish their stories? Do they, I mean, take it steps forward in the process of production?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I'm going to talk. That was the third. That's what I'm going to talk on to say. For example, in the case of the inmates, they have created their editorial project. So they're not just write their own books. They have learned the publishing process. They have published 12 books of their own. So the documentary film is about this process. So it started as a creative writing project in which they were writing their testimonies in a very heterodox way. So the women that knew how to read and write were writing the stories of those that didn't know how to read and write. But they were discussing through their life stories violence, state militarization, and they were including their reflections on the text. So the first book, they wrote a book and I got funding to publish their book. But then they say, because they are in prison in this specific project, and they said, well, but the problem is that there are indigenous women in prison. When we go out of prison, it's going to be very difficult for us to make our lives writing books. We want to learn to make the book, not just to write it. So I invited a woman that was working in a master program in the editorial process, and they learned to use the computer programs for editing, and they are designing their covers, and now they have published 12 books already, and because of the impact of some of their publications, they were able to review their cases. And 9 of the 13 that started the projects are not out, and that are working in other prisons, are part of the same collective, it's a collective. So it's also how to accompany the knowledge production. And in this case, at the beginning, I was they did everything by hand, so I was capturing this, I was editing, I looked for the funding to publish their book. But now is their project. Now they are selling the books, and with the money that they are selling the books, they are publishing other books. So and they have a radio program also. So I think that it's also, that this dialogue is also a dialogue in which you can accompany processes in which knowledge production comes in different forms.
Is there space for questions?
في حدا تاني عنده سؤال أو ملاحظة؟ Go ahead.
So actually my other question is about the role of theory in our lives and how theory influences reality and practices. And decolonization of feminist decolonization actually entitled us or requires that not only we theorize from below or by understanding what's going on, but also influencing, so the other way around. And what you just commented on Roger's comment shows me that although you worked on this part of the circle, which is bottom up, there's still a lot to do from top down, because part of our challenging to the ongoing system is really challenging the hierarchy, including the academia, including the work in NGOs, including the work in governments in general. And so far, like at this, my specific question is, how can we decolonize the power structure in academia influencing reality and practices?
Yeah, I think that is.
My question is very long, but maybe you could talk about the Zapatistas. Is there a model of education, anyway linked to Hadia's question, the way they try to create an alternative education system?
I think that, well, one is our universities, that are public universities linked to the state universities. I think that it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge because we are walking against the wind. And I mean, this experience that I'm telling you in CSS, we have been a lot criticized. They call us new agey because of the workshop on emotional things. They say that the kind of production that we do academically is not serious. So it's a huge challenge. And I publish some of my publications are in the academic world, but some others are independent editorial projects in the copyleft movements, blah, blah, blah. But there are other experiences that are, I'm part of the system because I work in a public institution. But there are other experiences that are taking place in Mexico. One is the Zapatista education system, in which it's an education system that was created in the autonomous regions. And in this case, they rejected, in Mexico there is an official textbooks until high school. So the state, the official history, everything is a text, it's a mandatory textbook. So they rejected the textbooks. They have been creating their own textbooks and creating collective history through their own collective methodologies. And a lot of the experience is beautiful because a lot of the teaching takes place out of the room. So the kids work a lot in the fields. They work a lot outside the classroom. And now there are two experiences of universities that are linked to this movement. One in Chiapas and one in Oaxaca are called the land universities, La Universidad de la Tierra. And I'm very hesitant about those projects. I have to go there and know them. My only concern is kind of an anarchist project inspired by the Zapatistas. But of course they don't get any title or anything. So what I'm concerned is because some of our students are leaving our institutions to go there. And I don't know what will happen when they finish.
In what
with their lives. So some of them, of course, it's a different life project. They will not get a job like the job that I could imagine. Probably they will go back to communities and organize, and I'm talking from outside, but I know that the two experiences were born inspired by the Zapatista movement at the university level. And they work a lot with the World Forum and the University of the Social Movements. There is something that is called the University of Social Movements, so they work with the University of Social Movements. So they are working with, they are rejecting the idea of sustainable development because they say that it's just an adjective for development. So they are working with, related with the land in a different way. It's a self-sustained project, and the students live in the university and they sustain themselves by raising their products there. And one of my nieces is going there. So that's what I'm saying, that I don't know what will happen. My sister is having a fit. Because, I mean, the big challenge is
Most innovations come from outside from universities. Anyway, most creative ideas and innovations come from outside universities. People will drop universities to do something creative, so don't worry.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I would add something really quick to that question, and I'll write their names down. So in Canada, they are working within universities, but they're Indigenous and have brought the idea of land-based universities.
Of what?
Land-based universities, because Indigenous knowledge production is always connected to the land. And they have been successful in creating a curricula where students are taken out on the land, like in the far north. So please look for Dr. Alex Wilson. She's a two-spirit queer professor, a woman. And Glenn Coulthard also writes about this. Cool.
It's interesting that both in Mexico and in Canada, the land is important because those universities are called the University of the Land, Universidad de la Tierra.
And he has a book called Red Skin, White Masks. Yeah. But really, really important. On Tuesday or Monday, I'll be sharing some of Dr. Alice Wilson's work. She's in the project with me.
Thank you very much. شكرا كثير. Thank you, Arna.
I'm leaving my book for your library, but I have a blog in which, because of this copyleft idea, so you can download some of my books. And
In English or Spanish?
I have both English and Spanish. I also have there a link to the editorial project, but the books of the inmates are in Spanish. I have not been able to translate none of their books, but they have a radio program also, and now the ones that are out. And the documentary film that we're seeing on Tuesday have been subtitled in English, and they talk there about their project and how writing, because many of them didn't know how to read or write before the project, so the process of changing from oral to writing then, and what writing has been. So here you can see the radio programs and some of the English.
Yeah.
I don't know if before you leave, I would love to show my students in Mexico, the students in Palestine. If I know it sounds very traditional, but can we take a picture together?
Sure. I had a question, a little one. It could be on the side. The translation part about the settler, is it because colonialism and settler thing are the same word in Spanish, or?
Because settler itself There is no word to say settler. You could describe it like to settler, to stay, would be to come to stay.
But I find this very interesting because the Spanish basically were one of the first colonizers in the world, and they went there and settled in Latin America ages before.
But we will say just colonial.
Yeah, in Latin languages, the word colonist means settler,
Okay.
and colony comes from the colonist.
Yeah.
So when you don't have to say settler, when you
Because it's
say,
there.
because it's there. You say colonial. So, but what happened is that after the independent movements, we're supposed to be decolonized. So it's the paradigm of internal colonialism. It's what had been pointing that colonialism stayed. So when it's what it would be like the equivalent. It will be what we have developed as a theory to point out that the colonial empire and colonial enterprise continues.